Hey, welcome to the Church in Action podcast. I'm Charles Galda. Sorry, we're a couple minutes late today. That's all my fault. We don't have our producer. We're between them, and I'm not enough to fill in for that person. And so sorry about that. But the Church in Action podcast, we talk about issues of God and culture to accelerate our ability to make disciples who do justice and share Jesus to transform New England. We know that when the people of God do the work of God, it's evangelistic. And people then want to know our Jesus. And so that's part of why Jesus says, go make disciples, people who are willing to disadvantage themselves, to be in unity, to love and serve others and fix our communities in the world. And that gives us the opportunity to tell them about Jesus. And so we've got a great guest today. I think you'll find this very interesting conversation. Mary Speta is the Chief Impact Officer at Amira, New England. If you're a regular listener, you'll probably remember Stephanie Clark from Amira being on quite some time ago. And so it's great to be able to catch up again. And Mary, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so for folks who don't know Amira, can you give them a little bit of background? Who are you guys and what do you do?
Sure. So we are a nonprofit based out of Massachusetts, and we provide exit and aftercare services to women who have experienced either sex trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, or prostitution, any combination of coming out of the sex trade. And so we do that in a variety of ways. We have a residential program where we offer long-term wraparound care in a safe home in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. We have a thriving outreach program where we are reaching women who are incarcerated, who are in correctional facilities, and also to women who are currently being exploited through our community resource center. And then we have an education program where we go around and we talk to people kind of like this and just kind of bring awareness of the issue of trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation so that the more people that know about it, the more people can get involved and the quicker we can end this thing.
And so can you give, because you guys are spending your lives really fighting this, right? Some of us are kind of tangentially involved, but you guys really, how big is this problem that you guys are focusing so much effort on it? Is it, and is it really a New England problem? How do you help some folks who may not have some of the data, if you would, please?
Yeah, it's pretty big. So if we look at it globally, it's the second fastest growing organized crime in the world at $150 billion a year. That's the most recent estimate. When we look at it nationally in the United States, there's often a myth that it happens in other countries or it happens through like kidnapping people abroad or something like that. But actually, it happens in the United States. It happens very, very frequently. And to our knowledge from FBI, Homeland Security that we work with, the majority of individuals victimized are U.S. citizens. They're women and girls, and they're usually women and girls of color coming from very vulnerable backgrounds. And so in the United States, there's an estimate that there's somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million victims. And it's definitely very prevalent in New England. We know from the FBI that there is no town in America that has not seen sex trafficking.
And so I want to just poke into just a little bit of that too, because I don't want to leave the folks with the impression that because it's disproportionately impactful in communities of color, that we don't see this in kind of white suburban 2-parent household families as the kind of folks who might say, okay, well, this doesn't apply to me. Would they be right or would they be wrong?
Well, it happened to me, and I'm white, and I come from a 2-parent household, very, very loving family. So you're absolutely right. It can happen to anybody. What happens usually is traffickers or exploiters, depending on the way that the situation is defined legally, they just look for someone who is vulnerable, who has some type of vulnerability. It could be poverty, it could be prior sexual abuse, it could be low self-esteem, and they gain the trust of that person and then end up exploiting it.
And so I remember seeing data from Connecticut a couple of years ago too, of that in that year, I think it was 2016, 200 children were referred to DCF that year alone as having been sex trafficked. And I imagine that number has grown because it had been growing to that point. So I imagine it's continuing to grow. Is that pretty typical of the New England states?
Pretty typical. And actually, even in the pandemic, Polaris runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they reported a 40% spike in trafficking reports through the pandemic. Even it's from what we know, the reports of it are even greater now.
That's interesting. Is there some understanding or hypothesis about why you'd see such a spike at a time where it's so hard to get out and do anything? I would have expected maybe other criminal activities we know dropped off some during spike, and some grew. This sounds like one of the ones that grew. Do we know why the pandemic would lend itself to a growth?
Well, the pandemic caused a lot of things. And so there's multiple theories, and there's lots of people working to get like the actual data. But there's multiple theories. One of those being that a lot of people lost their jobs. You had several survivors who had gotten out of their trafficking situation, who lost their jobs, couldn't economically support their family or keep their housing. And so what do? You turn to the only thing that you know that brings in money. People who are housing insecure suffered greatly through the pandemic and were largely exploited. People who struggle with addiction diseases as well. And so those are kind of like really big contributing factors. The pandemic hit the hardest on the most vulnerable populations. The other thing is that a lot of these reports are coming from victims themselves, finding an opportunity to basically say like, hey, it is worse now in the pandemic. Please help me get out.
Okay, I got you. And so give us, so you're mentioning that what a trafficker does is looks for something exploitable and then seeks to build trust. Can you share a story or two of what that looks like, just so folks understand? And maybe, if you can, maybe one online way they do it and maybe one in-person way they do it?
Yeah, I think that the way that commercial sexual exploitation works in the United States, first of all, I'll say it works differently in the United States than it does in other countries. So it's important to remember that. I think when people think sex trafficking, they often think like the sex tourism that you see in like Southeast Asia. And that happens there, but trafficking happens differently in every part of the world. And it also happens differently in different regions of the United States. But typically in the US, you'll see a trafficker identify a girl or a young woman, gain her trust, and then use something as leverage. If she has a child, if there's a way to blackmail her, threats against her family, any number of these things, to eventually put her in a situation of being exploited. So in trafficking, legally, for it to be considered trafficking, one of three elements needs to be involved. It's either force, fraud, or coercion. So force is what it sounds like. Fraud would be like taking away all of her documents and not allowing her to leave. So she has no identification. There's no way that she can get out.
Passport, for example, in an immigrant community. Right, okay.
Yeah. Or once he puts her into a situation where she's being prostituted, then telling her, you can't go to the police now because I will tell them that you were in prostitution and they will arrest you. Or coercion, which are those threats against her life, threats against her child's life, threats against her family's life, in any number of ways. So what we see now is a lot of online exploitation. Women are most often, and this happens to men and boys too, victims are most often posted online and then ordered. So either, a buyer will either show up at a hotel or have the victim come to their house. And this happens on like major websites. I mean, Twitter, Facebook, Craigslist, things like that. Then there's other websites that are designed for this, like Bedpage. And what we also see now is a lot of online exploitation around pornography, OnlyFans, that like really big popular website now is largely being used by traffickers, posting trafficking victims on there. And that's kind of the basics of how it goes. Every story is very individual, and very, very, very personal to each victim. And I try to steer clear of like telling super traumatic stories. But if we think about this from the perspective of manipulation, psychological coercion, those are the most common tactics that traffickers use to get someone to do this. I mean, no one just willingly goes and sells their body. No one willingly puts their body online. There has to be something very, very severe to put them in that position of needing to do that.
Yeah, I'm remembering when I first started to learn about it, it was almost like the same grooming techniques that a pedophile uses, where they'll connect with find someone online, get them to engage with them, get them to either confess something that they wouldn't want their parents to know, or get them to send a picture or something like that, and then use that to move them along. Well, now if you don't do this, I'm going to share that, and out of fear they do it, so they're being blackmailed or coerced, to your point. There also seems to be this another scenario that comes up repeatedly, and a friend of ours would say this was their story, is that he was my boyfriend. The guy who exploited was my boyfriend, and I loved him, and I did this once because we needed to, but I didn't realize the whole time he was manipulating me, and then once turned into regularly.
Yeah.
And is that a common story?
It's very common. It's actually the most common. I think a lot of people think that, and I had this understanding too before it happened to me, that trafficking happens by getting kidnapped, particularly like child napping, and or that it's like some kind of stranger. You know, I was taught stranger danger. But actually, across the board, any kind of sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, trafficking, most of the time, the person doing the abusing is someone that the victim actually has known for a while and trusts. So yeah, it's usually a boyfriend. For me, it was a boyfriend. It was not something that ever really crossed my mind until I was in the middle of it and kind of looked around and was like, oh my gosh, what's going on?
Mm-hmm. And of course, we also hear stories about parents for drugs will traffic their children and things like that. What profile is there? Let me have a better way to ask. Is there a profile of woman who you serve that you find something common that is more receptive to a message of there is something else and that I can get out of this? Or is there really no pattern to them? Because I know from other conversations, especially with Stephanie, about it's really hard to convince somebody that there is another option. Mm-hmm. Are there commonalities to what's effective there or what's not?
Yeah, I think that everyone has a breaking point. You have to be ready to leave that situation. There's something called trauma bonding that happens in trafficking. You know, we get the question all the time, like, well, why didn't you just leave? You know, there's this really intense bond between the exploiter and the person that they're exploiting. And the person that they're exploiting defines this bond as love. And a lot of times that person has been looking for love in all of these places, and this is the one place that she's getting it consistently and is getting this attention. And hey, if she has to give something to get this in return, that's what she's going to do. And so there's like this huge fear that leaving means that love is never going to happen again. The other reason is there's a huge fear that she's not going to be able to survive apart from her trafficker. She might not have any skills, no opportunity to go to college. Isolation is a huge technique used by traffickers, keeping victims away from family members, friends, completely separating them from any other kind of community. And so there's a huge distrust there because she's been taught to not trust all of these other people. So yeah, if when people like us and Amira, come in when for example, a social worker reaches out and says, "Hey, I'm working with a woman. I think she's being exploited. Can you talk to her? See, if there's an opportunity for her to come into your program." She doesn't trust us right away. There's nothing that we can really say because of the level of manipulation and trauma that she has experienced. She has to be ready to take that step to say, I've hit my breaking point, whatever that is, and then move forward. Because honestly, I'll tell you, recovery is harder than staying in the first couple of years, because the trauma doesn't hit until you're out. Most of us have post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's a reason why it's called post-traumatic, not current traumatic. The PTSD doesn't hit until you're out of the trauma.
And so what might that look like then? Is that I know of someone who has PTSD and they're not able to work or do anything right now. Is it that kind of thing, or is there commonality about what that PTSD looks like for people who've been trafficked, or is it unique to each person?
It's unique to each person because it's based on the specific trauma that they have experienced. But I will say that there's a huge amount of healing that is possible. I know so many survivors who live with PTSD who thrive with PTSD, and it healing from it is this process of recognizing your triggers, recognizing where that is coming from, and addressing that trauma in a safe space with people that you trust, with trained people that you trust. And it's that kind of slow acceptance of this happened, desensitizing to the triggers that came out of it, so that you can slowly move forward and live your life not defined by that trauma.
And so what is it's about a 2-year program. And I know it's a little bit different for each woman, but of the folks who come into the home for the program, what does that program look like, and how does faith inform it?
Yeah, we have a whole person program, meaning there's this whole person theory that all of us are made up of 6 aspects: social, emotional, physical, psychological, spiritual, and vocational. So those are the 6. What we do is when women come in, they work with their case team to make goals in each of those areas. What's her vocational goal, for example? All right, I want to go to college and I want to become a social worker. Great, let's work you through those goals. Step 1, prep for your college application, step 2, etc. Same thing with emotional goals, for example, emotional regulation, which helps with that PTSD thing, being able to manage my triggers. Awesome, let's work through these goals together. The goal of the program ultimately is that she can live independently and thrive and not be re-exploited. And so that's like how the whole program ends up being, and it's an average of 2 years. The way that faith works into it is that spiritual aspect of healing. Our goal is that she comes to an understanding of forgiveness and that she's able to forgive herself. I know that can kind of sound weird because when we think of victims of crime, it's like, oh, why do they have to forgive themselves? This was done to them. But I'll tell you, as someone who's been exploited, when I got out and I moved on with my life, I didn't understand what had happened to me until a lot later. And I had so much anger at myself once I understood. I had anger at myself for making really stupid decisions, for not seeing the whole situation for what it was. And I had to learn to have compassion for myself because I didn't have all the information, and to eventually forgive myself for those decisions, because while I was presented with choices, I wasn't presented with good choices, which meant that I really didn't have a choice. I was getting by. I was surviving. And that's the goal of the spiritual aspect of the program, is that she comes to that understanding of what true forgiveness is, how that is defined in, in a healthy way, in a healthy perspective, so that she can achieve that real true inner peace and move forward, understanding her true value in the world.
And I remember from being in the Massachusetts, you've got Bible verses around, and the caseworkers it's common to pray with the women and certainly pray for the women. And so it's certainly faith informed. Are women required to go to church, go to a Bible study, those kinds of things?
We have no requirements of that kind. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the big ones being that most of the women we have served, unfortunately, have been bought by pastors, ministers, missionaries, other kinds of faith leaders. And so if we were to force a faith upon them, it wouldn't be genuine. And that's true of anyone. If we require a faith of anyone for any kind of program, it doesn't matter if it's trafficking or not. If it's required and it's forced and it's not genuine faith. So our policy is we do this work because of our faith, because of what Jesus has done for us. And, the better thing to do there and the more Christ-like thing to do is to model that for her rather than force her into it. And honestly, the majority of the time, they end up asking questions pretty quickly about Jesus, about Christ, about faith, about we get questions all the time, like, why would you do this for me? Why are you giving this to me for free? What do you want in return? It's this shocking love.
Yeah. And I would assume it would be compounding. They've been forced into so many things. It would only compound it and maybe even break trust. I don't know enough about it, but to now I'm going to force you into something too.
Yeah. Because then she's going to look at us just like we're another exploiter.
Mm. So you guys have a house in Connecticut. You've got a house in Massachusetts. You're ministering to women who are not in the house as well. And doing awareness and education programs online, in person. If somebody's listening to this and they're saying, well, why isn't my church doing this? Or this is, we keep talking about justice. This is this has justice written all over. What should they do? Or if they want to, even if their church isn't interested, right? What should they do?
They should call us for sure. We would love to talk. Well, we have an amazing church partners program, and we really value partnerships with churches. It's not a one-way street. And what we do at Amira is we like to educate our churches and work with churches to understand, what does trafficking look like in your area? What does exploitation look like in your area? How can your individual church become a safe place for potential victims, for survivors? And then, hey, let's get some people in to volunteer in our home. How about we set up a prayer team at your church? We have a bi-monthly prayer meeting with all of our church partners on Zoom. And so we create a partnership so that churches can not only be involved in the work that we're doing, but they can be equipped to serve people directly right where they are.
And so it's interesting some of the roles that you mentioned, because I think some of us might have the view that, well, if I sign up for this, I'm on the front line ministering to a woman. I don't feel equipped to do that at all. Or helping take a woman out of that situation. I'm not equipped to do that at all. And it sounds like you're talking about there's a lot of roles both in the house that are not quite so intimidating for beginners, and roles even in my church before I would even get to a house, or if we're not close enough to be able to get to a house, there's still a role for us that's maybe non-threatening, and then maybe God calls us to something threatening, different story, but non-threatening to start. Is that?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's lots of ways to get involved. I think the bi-monthly prayer meetings are fantastic. So you really, it's not just coming together to pray, but also to really explore some aspect of Christ-like justice and to talk about like what's going on in the world, being educated on it. I think that when it comes to volunteering in the home, It can sound kind of scary, if you've never heard of trafficking before and exploitation, all of a sudden introduced to it, and now it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to be in front of a woman, but I promise, I'm a survivor. We don't bite. We're normal people. We're human. And what these women are really looking for, what's valuable for them, is just a friendship. So coming to volunteer in the home, we have case managers, we have professionals who do all of the hard stuff. What our volunteers come in and do is hang out, help cook a meal, drive a woman to a doctor's appointment, watch a movie, have a conversation. And that in itself, our whole program is about healing and community, and our volunteers are part of that community. So it's just, being her friend, contributing to her recovery in that way.
So all I have to do is love her.
Yeah.
I think the Bible might say something about that, in fact.
I think there's some verses.
Right? And so talk a little bit, you talked about how it's not a one-way street, that you guys want to partner with churches and other ministries in your work. What's an example of how you do that? What's the kind of feedback loop for them, if you will?
Yeah. So we do trainings on trafficking awareness for churches. That's one of the big ways that we equip churches to understand this, and not just understand it kind of, broadly, but understand, what are the red flags in my area? What should we talk? We bring in case examples of trafficking that has happened in that church's town or in the surrounding area. And talk through, how do you look for that? I was just in a meeting with Homeland Security, and they said, most often the best tips that they get on trafficking cases come from community members, come from neighbors, people who've been educated on this. And so that's a big way. And the other way that we're partnering right now with churches is through our Safe Church series. So it's a training series program where we talk to churches specifically about how sexual abuse, sexual assault, exploitation happens, so that they can be really equipped to identify it even in their own space, understand how abusers think, understand how that impacts victims.
And so talk about that a little bit more. That sounds interesting. And so it sounds like it's not, I think my understanding of what you do when you do kind of normal awareness and prevention training is that might be a one-night thing in a church or a one-day thing in a church or something like this. This sounded more like it's a series. And so can you flesh the program out a little bit more for folks?
Sure, yeah. So we ended up doing this in response to a particular situation that was headlined recently, an unfortunate case where major spiritual leader Ravi Zacharias was found to have been abusing women sexually. And if you look at the details of that case in certain situations, it actually could be defined as trafficking, as exploitation. And we kind of looked at each other and said, this is not the first report we've seen like this, and we need to talk about this. And who better to go in and train churches than those of us who've lived it, and those of us who live walking through the recovery with women every day. And so the series is a 3-part series. The first part is a training with me where we talk about power dynamics. We talk about how abusers use their power to abuse and cover it up. What does that mentality look like? What is the charisma necessary to be abusive at that level and get away with it? How can churches recognize that sooner and be a safe space for victims? The second part of the series is with one of our staff members, one of my team members who's a former pastor, who comes in and just looks at policies and makes recommendations of, hey, this is what you could do better. And here's some ways to do that. And then the third part of the series is with our CEO, also a pastor, just has a no shame talk about sex, no shame sermon about sex for churches. Because what we have found, honestly, is So often a lot of abuse happens and a lot of victims are primed for abuse because they don't have a context for what sex is, or what good touch, bad touch is, or anything like that. And so we kind of talk about sex from a no shame perspective and just kind of get the stigma off of it so that we can really have a healthy perspective on this and the framework of the way that Christ has this, so that we can be better.
And so when you talk about the charisma, I thought that was an interesting point. So are you talking about the charisma in terms of being able to groom or recruit someone that they can have leverage over? Or are you talking about the charisma that's necessary to keep your governing body from exercising their responsibilities when accusations come up, or both, or neither?
Both and more.
Okay.
Kind of like what I was saying with, stranger danger, kidnapping happens less than 1% of the time. Most abusers are known. Most abusers are trusted by the people they end up victimizing. And it takes a lot of charisma to not only gain their trust, but have it continue over a long period of time, and for no one to either notice, or for those who have noticed to not say anything, to find ways to cover it up. In all of the reports that we have seen about church leadership, church leaders having been found to have been abusing people, there are moments along the way where people in their governing body or people in the church noticed something, said something, and the abuser's charisma was able to basically explain those red flags away. And of course, if you're dealing with someone who's not charismatic, who maybe feels a little weird and kind of is that like guy that you deem as like creepy, who stands in the corner, them explaining something away is not going to matter to you. You're still going to report something. You're still going to say something. But if it's someone that you've served alongside 20 years and, did your kids' baptisms and you have over regularly for barbecues, if they explain something away, you're going to believe it. And so that's a big way that charisma plays into power, how it's used for the benefit of the abuser.
I think we do see some commonality amongst a number of these cases, right? We see a commonality of, I think you're right, charisma, that can borderline on awe in some cases because of how significant that leader is. Rabbi Zechariah is a great example of that. We're friends, right? And I don't want it to be true.
Yeah.
I'm guessing a conversation about this is how Satan derails ministries. That he does, right? We know he's out there trying to do that, but then we leverage all of that into, okay, I'm going to give my guy the benefit of the doubt. And we don't, and it seems to me the bias needs to shift for the protection of the leader, and the ministry and the person. And we kind of shift to the benefit of the leader.
Right.
And so in the corporate world, which is most of my background, right there, if there's an accusation, right, there is a defined procedure, there is an investigative capability, and there's no bias towards, right, at least in my experience in the corporate world, there's no bias to, well, we're going to trust the guy because we know about the issues that creates. It seems like in the church, we haven't figured that out. Does the program, when I walk out of that program, would I have the right kind of policies and capabilities to move beyond, well, we're going to give the benefit of the doubt and not prejudge someone guilty, but we're going to give the benefit of the doubt to the person raising the concern and then know what to actually do? Or is this more about awareness that we need to figure out we need something like that?
What we do is by the end of the program, you're able to identify those policy areas that need to be improved. And if you're not able to improve them internally, or if we say, hey, this is too extensive for us, we have referral partners who work specifically on church policies. Because sometimes it's an easy policy fix that we work with you on, but sometimes it could be the way that your governing body is structured. Some churches don't have that oversight of whoever the senior pastor is that is biblical and is done in a healthy way. And so we work with a firm. We refer churches to them to be able to do that. But what I'm more concerned with, people being able to come out of this series, able to think about this in a new way and in a healthy way. For example, you said a lot of times we lean toward the benefit of the leader. And we perceive benefit of the leader as not reporting it, as not saying something, because then it allows the leader to continue to cover up and continue to pursue that. That's not a benefit to the leader. If you are actively abusing someone, in order to actively abuse someone, you have to remove the imago Dei from their life. You have to look at that person and not see the image of God. And once you have done that, you have moved away from God. So us not saying something is not benefiting that person at all. One of the things I talk about in my training is that we do not crucify abusers on the cross of public shame. I think that's something that we have seen secular society do a lot with the Me Too movement, with a lot of stuff that has gone on there. And that is not to the benefit of the abusers. And it doesn't help the victims either. If I, as a victim, were to go and publicly shame my abusers and say all these horrible things and, cancel culture and all of these kinds of things, it doesn't bring closure to me at all. It doesn't bring healing to me at all. What it does is it further harms their family. It furthers the impact of the situation, and it doesn't actually result in anything beneficial for anyone other than a big media snafu.
Yeah, it makes me as part of the social mob feel virtuous.
Right. But
without having to be virtuous, it makes me feel virtuous, right?
But our goal as the church is to benefit those individuals who are abusing, is to get them out of the situation where they can be abusive and to start shepherding them away from that. And those two processes should be done very, very separately. I want to be very clear right now. We should never involve victims in the process of shepherding abusers. They should be kept separate. And the mandating forgiveness, all of that, that's a whole other. That's something that I actually cover in the training. But we have to. That's another thing, is we have to rethink what is benefiting an abuser. Yeah. What is our role in that?
I think for some people it'd be hard to hear this, so I want to be careful in saying it. But I think it's an important point that goes with what you're saying. Is that I don't know how I know as the abused we need to forgive. I don't know how good I would be at that, but there is a sense in which I remember somebody saying the abuser is not the enemy; they're a victim of the enemy, and there's a redemptive work that has to happen there too. Is that fair, or does that make light of the abuse?
I think it's fair when we look at it in context. For example, I've been abused by 4 people in my life, and I know for a fact that every single one of them was severely abused before they abused me. And this is often the case where abusers were first broken themselves by someone else. And then they turn around and do it for a variety of reasons. It could be power, it could be self-esteem, whatever it is. And so you're right. We have to look at abusers and ask, what got you to this point? I don't think that anyone enters the world and grows up thinking, I want to be a rapist. I don't think anyone does that. Something has to happen to get you to that point where, for whatever reason, you're doing that. And I think that could mean that they're either a victim of past abuse, a victim of culture telling them that they have a right to other people's bodies, which is doing them a disservice, whatever it is. But I would agree that we need to look at abusers from a broader context.
And I think, and I just want to tease out a nuance too about what I was saying before about the notion of, I don't think I agree with you. I don't think we're benefiting the abuser by ignoring it. I think what happens in governance bodies, though, is we give the benefit of the doubt, not to benefit the person, but the benefit of the doubt. So he says this, she says that. And so the benefit of the doubt goes to him because he's my friend, because I know him, because he's a great man of God, because I can't believe he would ever do, right? I think that's what needs to shift in those governance conversations is the benefit of the doubt, not prejudge guilt. I want to be careful because that's, I think to your point, that's what society wants to do.
Right.
But let's give the benefit of the doubt to the accusation and treat it with seriousness and diligence and figure out and have the kind of processes and capabilities to know, okay, is this true? And not, well, we'll do something cursory or we'll ignore it because of all the good.
Yeah. And I think one of the responses that's common that we get from governing bodies that I've heard is, well, what if it's a false accusation? And I hear that, I recognize that concern. But there are a couple of things that I think we need to remember when it comes to false accusations. First of all, they're extremely rare. All of the statistics say that false accusations happen something like less than 2% of the time. But even when false accusations happen, there's a reason for it. There's a reason for someone coming forward and saying, this happened, either something happened to me or I saw something. And so it's, even if it comes to be a false accusation, it's still a reason to pursue. There's a reason that false accusation is coming forward. There's something broken there. It may not be sexual abuse. It may not be sexual assault, but there is something going on. And so no matter what, even if you think it is a false accusation, there is a biblical reason to pursue.
Well, and I think, and we can step away from even the biblical reason. I don't think we need a reason in addition to a biblical reason, but even if you don't necessarily see that, and there's a governance reason. If you are part of the governing body, you have a legal accountability for that ministry, right? And you can't just ignore something. And I agree with you, even if it is false, it may point to something else, but it may just be, no, this, Satan's going after this ministry and got this person for reasons of their brokenness to say something. But as I've been an elder, I've been a deacon, right? I've been on boards of multiple, right? I would want to know it was not true. Mm-hmm. Not, I would want to assume it's not true.
Yeah.
Because I have accountabilities, not just to the authorities of the world and to our shareholders or stakeholders. I've got a responsibility to God.
Right.
Right. That this was going on and I turned a blind eye to it imputes guilt to me, I think. And I don't want to have anything to do with that. I want to do the right thing. And part of what happens, though, I think in these conversations, or at least I think this, so tell me if you see otherwise, is even when you get, I'm one of 20, and I think we ought to investigate, I can't sway the group. Mm-hmm. And now you've got to stand up to the group and try and sway the group. And the leader is in a better position to control that dialogue than the one. And so do you see that? And what does the one do then?
Well, I think that you mentioned it already. You have a legal obligation, a fiduciary obligation to the church as being part of a governing body to pursue that. And so if it is like a 1 versus 20 kind of a situation, and you really believe that there's something going on here, the legal avenue is often pursued, and something that we see, there's something called corporate Stockholm syndrome that we see in these kinds of situations, and we saw it. I'll use the Ravi Zacharias example again. In 2017, a woman came forward whom he sexually abused, told her story, and the entire corporation turned against her and publicly shamed her. And that was an example of corporate Stockholm syndrome. Stockholm syndrome is another term for that trauma bond, right? So this intense bond to this very charismatic leader, who is claiming, God put me in this place. God is allowing me to do these things. You have to pay attention to me. Clearly she's lying. That's corporate Stockholm syndrome. So as the 1 versus the 20, something to be aware of is that corporate Stockholm syndrome could be going on here. There could be other people doubting the situation, but that bond to that leader is keeping them from saying something. So pursuing legal options is not a problem.
Yeah, I think the challenge in it though is if I'm 1 and it's 10 or 20, and the charismatic leader is saying, "Hey, no," I'm not convinced there's something that's happening. I just don't know. And it seems to me, I can see easily that dynamic. And Willow Creek is another place where we saw that same thing, right? We've seen it in a lot of places. But I'm not convinced. I think, and maybe it's that we wait to be convinced, but we're never convinced because we don't actually do the investigative work to find out because we trust what we're hearing. Is that a common dynamic too? Is that the same thing or is that a different dynamic?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. And I think, what I would just encourage people in those kinds of situations to think of here is think of the potential victim. Like is there more harm in you not saying something and a victim potentially continuing to be abused? Or is there more harm in you saying something and that victim getting help?
Yeah. Well, and the smart, charismatic leader, I know that kind of, there's so much harm if we look at this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's going to destroy our industry. Right. And I think you have to put that stuff aside because what we see over the commonality of all of these cases that I've looked at is we heard about this 5 years ago and we trusted.
Yeah.
And then it destroyed the ministry. Right. So it wasn't, hey, look at it and destroy the ministry. It was 5 more years of damage, and then we'll destroy the ministry because eventually it's going to come out. And I think that's where I think boards, and we've had some of this conversation on our own board, is you should never trust me, right? Because if something like this comes up, right, I don't want you to. I want a clear investigation, right? If I'm an honest leader, I want an honest investigation because I want my name clear, right? Yeah. And if I'm telling you we shouldn't look at this, I think that should make you more suspicious than anything else.
That's true.
But it's board after board doesn't seem to see it that way. And maybe it's that Stockholm syndrome you're talking about. They can't get past it.
I think it's also valuing power over responsibility. Because if that leader goes down, that governing board's probably going down too.
Yeah. The smart thing to do in that situation, the only thing I can think of that's a smart thing to do is if you can't sway the board, your obligation is to resign.
Yeah.
And I'd argue and say why. Because otherwise you're trying to sway a group of people who aren't seeing it your way and you don't have leverage.
Yeah.
And the only way you have leverage is to say, well, I'm going to say something about it and I'm going to resign. And I think you have to resign because otherwise now you're legally accountable. Forget about it in God's eyes, although I don't think you should forget about it. But you also right? If you can get past that somehow, you've got legal accountability in this world. But you've got a much bigger accountability beyond this world. And I think it just gets lost in the dynamics, it sounds like. And so before we run out of time, so if I'm hearing this, and I'm saying, actually, we need to, because I think that's what's missing. We need to be prepared for this to happen, not wait till it happens. Yeah. And so it sounds like your training gets a lot at prepare for it. So how do I get connected to it, find it, sign up for it?
Yeah, email us at info@amirainc.org, or you can just go to our website, amirainc.org, and fill out the contact us form. This is this training series specifically, we actually offer for free to all churches. It's our only training service that we offer for free because we don't want any barrier of access to this. As someone who has lived through this, who was sexually abused as a child, who was sexually abused in the church. I don't want to see another victim go through this. And so reach out to us. We would definitely love to talk to you, and find a time to train your staff. What we do with these trainings is we train anyone that you want us to train. Staff, volunteers, boards, elders, deacons, whoever it may be.
And so AmirahInc.org is AMIRAHINC.org. Yes?
Yep.
I need somebody to check my spelling.
Yeah.
But just say that point again, because I think and I don't want to skim over this, because we talked about the high visibility cases that we've talked about. You just implied that, well, those aren't all there is. This is happening elsewhere in the church. Did I hear you right?
Yeah, the statistics that we have, if we there's enough data out there that we can generalize, if I were to use the super academic terms. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men will be sexually abused or sexually assaulted by the time they turn 25. And so if we take that data and take like a church that has 100 people in it, evenly split with 50 women, 50 men, that statistically tells us that 25% of that church has experienced sexual abuse and is either currently experiencing it or has experienced it in the past and needs to heal from it. So creating safe churches not only helps people who are currently being victimized, but it helps those people who haven't healed from it yet. Because those are the people who also need help. They need to move past this, because we've seen such high rates when it comes to suicide, self-harm, domestic violence, further abuse by those who have not healed from the abuse that's happened in their lives.
And so that's a great point, because we do hear the stories of, even in small churches where the pastor might do this, but even if the pastor isn't doing it, they need to be equipped to respond to it. Yep. And so what do you do when a woman comes in and says, my husband's abusing me?
Yeah.
And we've seen scenarios where that pastor is not equipped for that and gets it pretty wrong. And I'm remembering talking to the key person in Connecticut on child sex abuse in DCF, and she said, "You don't think when you're doing this work, your choice is either I don't help or I do help. You can do harm.
Yeah.
In trying to help." And I think that's where pastors really need to be sensitized to this as well, to the extent they're not. And of course, many are and will know and understand this. But we did do a series with Bonnie Gatchell, or an episode with Bonnie Gatchell a while ago from Rootwood Ministries. Folks can look that one up if they want to, where she talked about some of the stories where pastors were not equipped for it. And so equipping and damage things. And so this equipping sounds like a good place. It won't get me ready to respond to everything, but it helps me to start to understand that there's a need, and maybe get my elders or other governing body to understand there's a need here, and where are areas we need to start looking at to be prepared to respond, and not do damage, but do things that would actually glorify God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, Mary, last word, go ahead.
I think that this is so important. I think it's a true mark of leadership. If you're in leadership in ministry and in a church, and you're willing to take on the hard stuff like this, and you're willing to look at the hard things for the benefit of the people like me who were abused. And I can tell you that if you have been abused, or you have been exploited, or you have been trafficked, or it's happening to you now, there is a way out. There is a way to thrive in it. There is a way to thrive in Christ. There is a way to move past this in your life. And so if we can play some small role in making this happen for anyone, check us out, reach out.
Thanks. And again, for folks, that's AmirahInc.org, AMIRAHINC.org, where you can email them at info at AmirahInc.org. And so, Mary, thanks so much for being with us today. Thanks even more so for the work you guys are doing at Amira. It's really so critical, as you know, critical, important, and it is an issue of justice. And so some people hear justice and they hear a political agenda. Some people hear justice and hear watered down gospel. When we talk about justice, it's fixing the things that God did not intend to have in this world, right? And human trafficking for sure is an issue of justice. And so I'm really grateful for you for your work in it. I'm grateful to Amira for their work. And I'm grateful for the partnership we've had over the years. But I'm thankful for your time today. I appreciate it. Sharing your expertise and helping us learn. And so thank you. And I'd like to thank our audience too. Hoping you heard something in this that was useful in raising awareness, thinking about your own family, how you talk about this in your church, to start to deal with some of the issues that Mary's talking about. And if you did, and you're convicted that you need to personally be doing something in this, or your church or your family needs to corporately be doing something, AmirahInc.org and info@AmirahInc.org, and then they'll get you plugged in, even if you're not in Massachusetts or Connecticut. And if you have any trouble finding those connections, give me a holler. You can go to our website and find ways to contact us as well. So if you're blessed by this, please like it, share it, follow us. But if you want more information, visionnewengland.org is the way to get us. Our next episode is July 8th. We'll be in our third episode of what we thought was going to be one episode, but we are our third episode with Dr. Emmett Price, talking about the evolving language of race and some of the challenges it presents as we even try to communicate with each other about it. So thanks so much. See you then. God bless you. And just keep praying for New England and that God uses his word to change his people so they can change New England. God bless you. Bye.